Hey guys, it's Keybros.
So today we're going to talk about the conflict between Western liberalism or individualism and Eastern or Oriental collectivism, and how this conflict actually can be resolved, and also how it pans out in Hong Kong.
Ideally, we believe that Hong Kong should be a mixture between the East and the West and be the best of both worlds. And this is reflected by the fact that we have two official languages, namely English and Chinese. We believe that Hong Kong people should have critical thinking, but at the same time, they must take personal responsibility for their actions and also show consideration and compassion to those around them.
Yep, so now we'll first analyze the pros and cons of both Western liberalism and Oriental collectivism. So first we'll start with Western liberalism. Now this idea originated from the Age of Enlightenment during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was proposed by certain philosophers such as Locke and Mill, who famously proposed the marketplace of ideas. Now what's the main advantages of this sort of idea? First of all, it encourages logic, people being logical, and also people being rational, i.e. rationality. So we should have mutual respect for each other's opinions, and we can actually openly discuss conflicts without any fear of retribution or violence. It also encourages critical thinking as well as developing your reasoning, which basically, in a nutshell, being independent-minded. Now, the main disadvantages for this is it could encourage some people to be quite selfish. They overly stress on being independent. And another thing I observe, because half my family is from Wales, is that the sense of value of family in the West is probably weaker than in the East. So, for example, children of my friends in Wales are not expected to take care of the elderly or the parents. They can simply go out and work after they've graduated, and that's it. Whereas I think that's quite different in the East.
Now let's move on to Oriental culture and Oriental collectivism. Now, obviously, we recognize that Chinese philosophy and Eastern philosophy in general covers many strands of philosophical thought, but the predominant strand of thought and school of thought would be Confucianism. Now, the main tenet of Confucianism, or one of its main tenets, it's the sense of uniformity. In a Chinese society, you're expected to play a role. For example, in a family, if you are a child, you're expected to obey your parents, respect your elders, and perform certain tasks or chores. So that's kind of ingrains an idea of a respect for authority in a Chinese society. And also, this kind of instills the notion that people should respect the wisdom of their elders and also respect the ideas which are passed on from the ancestors, 祖宗. In an Eastern society, patriotism is also very important. For example, if you study Chinese history, you will come across many stories of heroes who have sacrificed themselves for the country. In the Song Dynasty, you have Fei, the story of him, 精忠报国, sacrificing himself for the nation. And that sense of patriotism is deeply ingrained in Chinese society, and it has been exemplified in many periods of history, for example, during the Balin Kongjin. And finally, in a Chinese society, you're expected to cooperate and help each other out. We have this saying called 养儿防老, which is the idea that you give birth and you raise your children in order that they would be able to take care of you when you become an elderly. And that sense of familial responsibility is also deeply ingrained in Chinese culture. However, one of the disadvantages or one of the cons that stem from Chinese culture is the idea that once you deviate from the majority, for example, once you express an idea that is controversial or that is not accepted by the mainstream, you would be condemned, ridiculed, and ostracized from society. Because in Chinese society, uniformity and respect for authority is very important.
So now we'll first apply Western liberalism and its ideas to Hong Kong. We want to say that most of the older generation in general are quite apt in adopting these Western values. It's just that some, not all, but some of the people, particularly in the younger generation in Hong Kong, but also some actually of middle age, lack the understanding of actually both Western and Eastern cultures. Let's look at the Western perspective. Now, I've said before that people should respect each other's opinions, but that doesn't really apply to the current younger generation, because you've got people who basically, when they disagree with you, they don't do so respectfully, and also they might engage in violence against you. They don't tolerate any form of dissenting opinion, which goes against Western values. And also everyone who is outside the herd in Hong Kong who doesn't agree with the violence is being considered as Lai Gong, i.e. they are licking the boots of the Communist Party, which is false, because you've actually got people who also have some criticisms of the government, they have critical thinking, and because they don't agree with the violence, they're immediately labeled as traitors or people who do whatever China likes. And that, I think, is one of the major problems of people not really applying Western culture in today's society.
Turning to a more political issue, we believe that many of the protesters don't actually comprehend or understand Western democracy completely, because we have talked to some people who are of the same age and who claim that they are fighting for this democratic cause. But when we ask them which system of Western democracy do they prefer, for example, between the UK and the USA, which have very different systems, they cannot answer our questions, and they do not understand the differences, whether subtle or explicit, between the UK system and the American system. So we believe that, in a sense, when you say that you are fighting for a democratic cause, you must at least have some idea, some conceptual idea of what democracy entails. And it appears to us that all they understand about democracy is the right to vote and universal suffrage. But democratic societies and civil societies go far beyond the right to vote. As he has mentioned before, in a democratic and civil society, we must have this marketplace of ideas where people can express their opinions without fear of retribution. But what is problematic in Hong Kong, particularly among the younger generation, is that they seem to blindly follow their peers and follow this herd, which in a sense they have an immunity from critical thinking, because they blindly believe in authoritative figures or authoritative news outlets that they believe to be impartial but are in fact very biased, such as Apple News and Stan News. And the problem with that is you immediately block out every news source which express a different opinion. And that is so anti-democratic and so anti-civil society.
And it also forms an echo chamber, I have to say, isn't it?
Yes.
Next, we'll apply Eastern collectivism towards the situation now in Hong Kong. Now, he's talked about Eastern collectivism entails respect for the elderly. But obviously that doesn't really apply nowadays in Hong Kong, because many young people, they disrespect the elders. There are actually many divisions in the family. For example, some people actually leave their homes because they have a different political view as the parents. And also they call some of the elderly people Fai Lo, which we've talked about in the colonial video before, which means they are useless elderly. That's a translation in Chinese. And I think in that sense, they're not really respecting the elderly according to Eastern Oriental Confucian values. Another thing is that they don't have patriotism. For example, the Ding Zhongbo God we talked about before. It doesn't really apply to this day, because many of the younger generation, they have zero sense of belonging towards China, which I don't blame them. I understand, but that's just the case, what's happening now. They have this sort of superiority complex over people in the mainland. They see the mainland as backwards. People there don't have culture, which might be the case maybe 30 years ago, but that's the past. If you see what's happening today, actually many cities in China have already surpassed us in terms of development, culture, living standards. So we should be open to these facts rather than be blinded by the so-called backward-looking phase of China in the 90s or the 80s. And also, we don't really understand the superiority complex, because people in Macau, another place which people often fail to talk about, but also runs one country, two systems, by the way. It was a Portuguese colony. And also Guangdong province, even some parts of Guangxi in China, people actually speak Cantonese. So it's the same language. So we're equals. I won't say we're inferior or superior to mainland Chinese people. We're just equal. And also the fact that some protesters refuse to condemn the very minority violent sect of protesters, even when they do something that is morally questionable. is actually showing the worst parts of Eastern collectivism, in the sense that they are fully or blinded by this uniformity and to conform and forget to have some sort of independent or critical thinking.
Right. Now, we must stress that we are not discrediting the whole movement by saying this. We do acknowledge the contribution of peaceful protesters who, by the way, make up the majority of those who have come out during the past year. And as long as they act according to the law, their rights should be fully protected. But the fact is, when you condone the actions of the very minority sect of violent protesters, you are actually instilling the sense of uniformity and not allowing people to deviate from this so-called mainstream opinion that even the violent protesters should be accepted as part of the protest. And I think when people are condemned or even irrationally condemned for leaving the majority or for deviating from the opinions of the majority, that is actually very problematic, because you are basically negating any room for critical or independent thinking. Now, in relation to our videos, we believe that when people blindly hate us simply because they disagree with us, or when they call us certain names or launch personal attacks instead of leaving constructive comments, we believe that is also a reflection of the fact that many of those who are from our generation, from the younger generation, have this sort of idea that anyone who disagrees with them automatically should be dehumanized, and they don't even deserve a conversation or a civil discussion.
Moving on to education, which we think is one of the main causes and the problem of what is happening now in Hong Kong. Now, we want to say from personal experience, because we went to a school in Hong Kong in the past, that the local education focuses a lot on memorization. So the teachers, often, like for example, liberal studies class, Chinese history class, etc., they provide model answers for us to memorize. We memorize the key points back at home, and during the exam we just spit them out. It's like 10 marks, 15 marks, and you just get them, all right? I think that's a major problem, which really forces people to not think out of the box, and also discourages critical and analytical thinking. We also find that some of the teachers are actually very biased in class. They will share posts on social media only for one side, and they don't share posts on both sides, which actually in a way explains why certain students are so extreme in their behavior nowadays. Now, it is totally perfect for teachers to have a view, but I think the best way for a teacher when they teach in the classroom is to teach both the pros and cons of a system. For example, Western democracy versus socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, I think what a responsible teacher should do in the class is to list both the pros and cons of these two systems, and then leave the students to decide which one is best, rather than to brainwash them with only one of these systems.
I think in Hong Kong, the media coverage of political issues or political news, especially in relation to the mainland, is also one of the root causes of the sort of social divisions that we are currently observing. Because, for example, a very prominent news outlet in Hong Kong, Now TV, recently reported on the international response to the imposition of the Hong Kong national security law. Now TV decided to report the fact that Japan, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, and Australia all voiced their dissenting opinions towards the imposition of national security law in Hong Kong. But they simply neglected the fact that 53 countries have come out in support of the national security law, including countries such as Cuba, Serbia, and Russia. There was absolutely no mentioning of this. And I think when the news coverage in a city or in any society is so biased, it again negates any room for critical thinking, because people are always fed information that are only of one side, and they have absolutely no way of discovering information that comes from the other side. Now, I'm not saying that outlets such as CCTV or Global Times are more trustworthy or more rational, more impartial than Hong Kong news outlets, but I'm suggesting that it is beneficial for Hong Kong people to have a look at both sides of the story and then make up their own minds. Because as citizens in a civil and democratic society, we should not force ourselves or confine ourselves to one of the two camps. It is quite easily observable that people who are of the yellow camp, they tend to read certain news outlets, and they wouldn't read news from the other side. And the same thing actually applies to the blue camp. It's just that they follow different news sources. And I think this is creating this sort of polarization and extremism in our society, where blue people cannot comprehend any thoughts which come from the yellow side and vice versa. And I think what makes us kind of different from most of people from our generation, but also most Hong Kong people in general, we would read news stories from both sides and then make up our own minds. I think a saying is particularly applicable to this scenario, which is the truth is always someplace in between. And when you simply look at sources from one side, you become easily illusioned. So just to sum up things which we have said in our video today, we believe the current generation of Hong Kongers, not all of them definitely, but for sure a substantial amount of them, are in fact reflective of what could be called worst of both worlds, in the sense that while they don't have the virtues of the East, they don't have the virtues of the West either. And what is more problematic is they have instilled in themselves the worst ideas which stem from the West, and also the worst ideas which stem from the East. And secondly, there has been this phenomenon of cultural appropriation, in the sense that the younger generation tend to call themselves Hong Kongers, but at the same time they exclude all other conceptions of the identity. For example, as he mentioned earlier in the video, they would call people from previous generations who disagree with them Philos, and in the process exclude them from this Hong Konger identity. And we believe that to be a Hong Konger means that you must be inclusive, and you must be accepting and open-minded to both Eastern values and Western values. And when Hong Kong people reject the good sides of the West and also the good sides of the East, it actually negates what it means to be a Hong Konger. So we believe that we must provide a different perspective and display the fact that to be a Hong Konger means that you must be a good mixture between the East and the West.
That's right, and I think it's quite true to say that Hong Kong people nowadays are actually rather anti both Western and Oriental values. For example, they lack the critical thinking, they lack the patriotism, and they also even lack the hard work and the work ethic, which people in the 60s and 70s are often famous for, like during the prosperous years of like the film industry, etc., etc. So I think we should take back control.
For us to take back control. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah!
And also restore the rightful identity of being a Hong Konger, i.e. the best of both worlds, and stop making the term Hong Konger being hijacked by a small minority sect of youngsters and other people.
Right, so that about concludes our video for today. If you liked our content, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Keybros so you can keep up to date to all of our videos.
And thank you very much for all the new subscribers. The number has skyrocketed in the past week. We really much thank you for your support and encouragement. We've seen all your comments, whether they're positive or negative. And as always, we try our very best to respond in our time. Okay, right. So cheers, guys. Bye.